All right, welcome everyone to the Wednesday, September the 20th Istio Ambient Weekly Contributors Meeting. First on the agenda, we have Kevin talking about service entry scope.
Yep. If we could open the doc. So basically what I was looking
Actually,
to do,
Kevin, do you mind opening the doc and present? I think that's a lot easier if you talk to it.
Sure. Give me a sec to open the community meeting notes. You guys should be able to see my screen now.
It's coming through.
Okay. So what I wanted to go over is kind of get a pulse check. This is from a couple weeks back, but there have been some updates and changes. What I really want to go through and kind of get a pulse check on from the community here at large is I've added a very deep list of what the exact goals are, and then kind of parlayed that to a bunch of solutions with whether or not we're meeting the original design goals. As a quick recap, for anyone who's not familiar, the problem that I'm looking to solve here primarily is like multi-tenancy and how service entry should work on conflict. So pretend we applied 2 service entries with the same host name in different namespaces. Like, how do we resolve this? What is the behavior that makes sense here? As a quick recap, the way that that we handle this in classic Istio is we have export to kind of restrict who can see things. And then we prefer our local namespace. And if we don't have that, then we kind of have an undefined, or we pick the oldest. This has a problem though. The problem is, for example, if I was a user in namespace 1 and some other tenant in the mesh applied a host name that I wanted to reach normally, they could like hijack my traffic and send it, right? So if I had requests going to google.com, some other user with permissions to create a service entry creates this service entry, all of a sudden my requests go to this VIP instead of Google. And so this is a problem in the existing service entry API that I want to fix in Ambient. And so kind of bringing that to the design goals, the one I'm caring about here, or I'm trying to solve that's new, is a multi-tenant safe environment that additionally meets all of the old requirements: the major use cases, shared host names, the external services, and VMs. And so the solution that I kind of brought forward is, this is my favorite one. There's a bunch of options kind of enumerated here. But basically, I want to provide a new mesh config where for ambient services, you provide the order in which you try to resolve services for a given client. So if you had shared external services, they would go in some shared admin level namespace, and other tenants wouldn't be able to break you because you're not in the resolution list, right? And then you could also prefer your own as like an override. And that's the basic sentiment. And I wanted to get a pulse check on this proposal. So I guess I'll give
for context, people, that mimics, DNS resolution order, right? Where you say, I want to resolve this host name against this list of either domain, subdomain, prefix paths, or DNS servers. Is it analogous to that?
Right, and so the way that this solves my original multi-tenancy problem is that if you're not in this list, you don't resolve. So if a tenant created google.com, it wouldn't resolve for me unless it was defined in one of these admin level protected namespaces. And I could override it if it was in this namespace and I had my own definition that I preferred. And so I can talk about the implicit match stuff, which I guess I'm sort of on the fence about, and it's worth discussing. But just to recap the initial design goals. So what I really wanted to do is I wanted to make sure multi-tenancy, we have safe controls, which this does. I wanted to make sure that we can define globally shared host names like googleapis.com, which you could do in an admin namespace. You could define a per user external service by putting it in, defining a fallback here and then overriding it per user here. So that's supported. And then the most interesting one and the most debatable one is defining a VM service, because we have a couple options. The services wouldn't be resolvable across namespaces in the same way that kube services are, unless we have this implicit match. But also maybe we don't want that. Maybe we're okay just using kube services.
Kevin, I'm thinking of the mantra that it's always DNS, and the bit of complexity that we're looking at here. If I'm seeing a surprising name resolution in my cluster, something I did not expect, what is my process for sort of understanding where that surprise comes from?
Sure. I think and hope that, at least with respect to Ambient, the proposal is just to do this for Ambient for now, but I'm open to doing this longer term, is that the documentation itself would say that the host resolves in this ordering. I think the current behavior, if anything, it's more defined than the current behavior, which is that you get this kind of prefer oldest and prefer local non-documented behavior.
Sort of non-deterministic.
Yeah, like today's behavior is even worse. I think documentation would help here, but back to my original objection, as a user, I was talking to Google and all of a sudden I'm no longer going to Google and I have no idea why, because some other person changed my Google.
Okay.
So Mitch, I think you make a fair point. It would probably be sensible to have an Istio cuddle analyze that told you how and where a service got resolved from.
Yeah, that makes sense. I hear that what you're saying is, while this may not be the most intuitive way to search for that, it is strictly better than our current experience, which is a fine argument.
Yeah, and I definitely think tooling and docs and everything we can do to help people understand it is ideal and definitely worth being part of the discussion.
Yeah, maybe Kevin, capture in your doc a note about adding some tooling to help people understand resolution order, because we see it as a common complaint. Everybody sees it as a common complaint. And so, something that mimicked the DNS tooling that told you how a DNS name got resolved is probably going to be quite useful to people.
Well, and particularly, I'm thinking of the persona being an application developer. The mesh config, I'm not sure would necessarily be visible to an application developer. In some cases, it might not even be in the same cluster. So some sort of way to expose that information to a non-privileged persona in a read-only format.
Well, they are seeing the outcome of the config written somewhere.
And
Right, so
that'll
I guess
be in XDS effectively.
Yes. So I guess it depends if you think like namespace names are privileged information.
I hope not.
Right, they're generally not, because they exist via DNS anyway.
Yuval is raising the possibility of another debug endpoint.
Yeah, which is along the same lines, right?
Yeah, historically we've hoped to get rid of or improve the debug endpoints because of problems with horizontal scalability and things, but it never did happen. So maybe we should just go with it.
Yeah, I'm somewhat ambivalent about what he would use as the tooling, but having dig, like I think that's the DNS equivalent, right, Stephen? Keith?
So I'm looking for it in the doc. I may have just missed it, but is the implementation side of this hierarchy mesh config DNS changes to the Istio DNS server running in Pilot agent? Is that how this is implemented?
So the initial idea for me was to have this focus on ambient, but I'm open to having this work also affect classic, in which case it would need to affect that DNS server as well.
And even with the ambient, it would be it would be implemented via the ztunnel DNS resolution. Is that correct?
Yes. But additionally, it would not just be for that. It would also be anytime we do hostname resolution. So even things like, there's future appetite, I believe, for waypoints being able to resolve service host names. What service does that waypoint get? Like if there's several host names defined, which version does it get? Well, it'll get a version based on this resolution ordering. So it's not just DNS.
Yeah, this is also
Yeah.
VIP resolution, Keith.
Yeah, I think, right. So for ztunnel, this would mean, like, I kind of laid out what changes this would require from the ambient perspective, which is ztunnel needs the mesh config so that it can kind of resolve according to the mesh config, and it'll need a copy of the services for, everything in this list. It'll have a service that matches that list, basically, and it'll need all services for all the namespaces. But waypoints will only have one. Same for ingress gateways. They'll have it pre-resolved by the control plane based on their own context.
Gotcha.
And so, yeah, that's covered here.
Yeah, thanks for the pointer. Go ahead, someone was saying something.
I had a quick question here. What if we have a multi-cluster environment, are we going to have to create this namespace ordering in each one of them and make sure that they're all synchronized? Or ideally, there should be like a service, right, which operates across clusters so that every cluster resolves consistently. Otherwise, you have to replicate this in every cluster.
Are these separate Istio installations? I thought mesh config would be one per cluster, in which case they're federated and resolve in their own federated way. Or there's a bunch of Istios with one Istio-D, and that has one mesh config. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the use case.
Is it fair to say that this is sort of like a enterprise DNS ordering, right? What does the IT admin want for? So it's more like a central service that needs to work across clusters.
That's exactly what I was thinking as well, Sanjeev. That's a good call out.
Yeah, I think that it's right. This is a mesh-wide setting, right? If the mesh spans multiple clusters, then it's
right.
valid.
But you have to now coordinate across meshes.
Well, no. Remember, like a common mesh setup, right? I have one control plane, sees one mesh config, and it is watching and controlling workloads in multiple clusters, right? That's the default multi-cluster setup. If you have a multi-control plane setup, then each of those control planes needs to see the same config, right? And we don't have any automation for ensuring that beyond what's provided with Helm and CI/CD.
Yeah. I guess the point was that if this is sort of like what the enterprise IT admin would want as the preferred order of external DNS resolution, he might, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud here that this is just in a multi-control plane, you have to provision this in every control plane and make sure they're all synchronized.
Yeah.
But logically, this is more like a central enterprise function, which says these are my validated ordering of DNS resolutions.
Yes, just like, you need to have the same CA setting in all those control planes, right, for the mesh to work. Keith, I think that you were next.
Yeah, I think that this is strictly better than what exists today. I completely agree with that. I do get the sense I have a sense of unease about this direction. Kind of similar to my unease when it comes to the ambient DNS stuff. I feel like Istio stops just short of being, to Sanjeev's point, okay, an enterprise DNS configuration provider or DNS server even. And I feel like this approach takes us yet another step into that direction. And I think personally, I think that step should be a purposeful one to say, okay, Istio is going to be a DNS server. Here's the plan for having a single pane of glass, a single way of reasoning about all the DNS things in Istio. It's just that's another mesh config setting. And again, I recognize it's strictly better than what we have today. And mesh config is a place we tend to stick things, configure stuff about the mesh. I don't have an issue with where we're putting it. But it does worry me the more Istio is stepping into the DNS realm, and what does that imply for future integration with kubeDNS, CoreDNS, etc.
See, Sanjeev has his hand up.
Yeah, just sort of more of the same thing here, which is that would it be useful to have a comparison if there was an alternative approach that could solve this problem via proper enterprise DNS management, and clusters simply point to the right enterprise DNS, as opposed to sort of taking over DNS mappings into each cluster control plane or into each mesh control plane. We are essentially, is it fair to say that we're becoming an alternate DNS resolver because we've got these resolutions for service entries and our own priority ordering, which may or may not align with enterprise DNS preferred resolution?
As far as I know, DNS cannot make decisions based on source namespace. It doesn't have that information. So I'm not sure we can use, enterprise DNS servers for that.
Yeah, I was thinking of some kind of policy where, depending on, again, we're thinking out loud here. This is a perfectly good solution, so maybe we're just sort of stretching it a little bit here. But the point is that this is sort of overlapping with enterprise DNS solutions. And your point about how to differentiate by the source namespace could be some kind of policy on the DNS resolution policy, just like different zones within an enterprise could have different DNS resolution policies even today. That's the analog of that. But is it worthwhile having a comparison where if I wanted to resolve this using an enterprise DNS, what would I do as a comparison of an alternate solution? Is that an exercise worth doing, maybe?
I think there's a fair amount of collective experience here with enterprise DNSs. I don't want to go ahead of custom.
Go ahead, Costin.
I think he's having trouble with this mouse.
Yeah, I can't hear anything.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Right. So. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Okay, sorry about it. We certainly have a pretty strong requirement to use enterprise DNS for different reasons. One is that we may have DNSSEC, we may have resolvers that use TCPs. There are all kinds of things happening in DNS space that cannot be handled by Istio DNS. So, it's not only core DNS, but I'm talking about real enterprise with proper signatures and proper checks, and that cannot be modified and intercepted. At the same time, enterprise DNS does have capability to do split horizon. They have rules that can do client-based override if necessary. So it's not completely impossible to address it. My primary concern with this proposal, and I don't mind, is that we need to figure out a way to make it work with without depending on Istio DNS. So either with a controller that is programming the enterprise DNS, or some other mechanism that doesn't rely on DNS exclusively. And maybe if we are discussing DNS configuration, we should have a DNS CRD or something that is specifically targeted to DNS, not overload the service entry. Remember that in Istio, we don't have by default enabled the DNS interception. So really today is not a feature that is on by default. It's just some users, it's not considered yet. I don't know if it's considered stable or not, but can we get the same thing without the reliance of DNS? That's really the problem.
Yeah, Istio DNS is an ENV var at this point. So it's like Istio meta DNS capture or something like that. And so what I think DNS is certainly a fine direction to go. It's the correct problem space for this issue. But the ENV, we're basically promoting or requiring the Istio DNS feature to be used by users who don't want this to happen. It feels like either need to invest a lot of time in making sure that thing is stable, or step off some other possible directions. Go ahead, Sanjeev.
Yeah, just one other point about enterprise DNS is that reasonably often enterprise DNS is tied into various kinds of threat reports about malicious DNSs and all that, and those are dynamically getting updated, right? Because this DNS has just today been discovered to be malicious or whatever. So enterprise DNS is sort of tracking those threat reports. Whereas if you have these mappings sitting out in the clusters, you essentially have created a parallel location for some of these resolutions. It doesn't get automatically updated with some of these DNS security sort of mechanisms that enterprises are starting to have.
So a few things to consider. So like one, we have the existing problem, right, of this being strictly better than what we already do. Two, this is used for VIP resolution, not just hostname, right, which DNS does not really help with. Then there's the problem of, can you get an enterprise DNS to even do per namespace split horizon at all? Right. Correct me if I'm wrong, Costin, but like Google's can't. Right. And part of the reason why they can't is they don't know who's calling. Right. And no enterprise is going to go provision a DNS IP per namespace on the caller side. Right. So enterprises DNSs are quite limited in what they can do, right? They're mostly configured by admins for global things. They may do regional split horizon, right, or some large locality, but they don't do it down to the namespace level, and they are very unlikely to ever do that. Cube DNS, right, can maybe do this, but mostly doesn't, right? Core DNS mostly does not do split horizon. And because the DNS names that are being allocated are Kubernetes DNS names, right? That security problem that you described, Rajiv, also exists within Kubernetes and core DNS, right? Because I can be creating DNS addresses in there, at least within the boundary of the cluster. I like split horizon is by definition every caller gets a different answer, right? Or at least groups of callers get different answers, but no enterprise is managing down to the namespace level.
Exactly.
Like zero.
Yeah.
Right, so that just doesn't exist. And it's like you're not going to get the network admins to do that.
Louis, are you saying that we should use Istio DNS interception always and rely on it? Or are you saying that we should not have DNS, we should not mess with DNS, basically?
Well, so it's a difficult choice, right? Kubernetes messes with DNS a lot.
And that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, I don't know if.
Well, no. The reason why they do it is they're never going to get the network admin to do the provisioning dynamically. Like, there's no way. They have to. Like, does anybody think like you're going to get your enterprise DNS, which is not core DNS, to keep up with change rates in Kubernetes for hundreds of clusters?
Well, Google,
No, I think obviously kubeDNS has its merits for intra-mesh resolution and all that, but here we're talking about public DNSs and external entries, which enterprise DNS does care more about than internal kube cluster DNS.
I do want to be really clear that a lot of what we're talking about is actually intramesh. Like a lot of these service entries, right? They're not necessarily like there are aspects of service entries that deal with external DNS names, but they usually don't actually mess. Like usually service entries that wind up out of the cluster are actually resolved elsewhere. The real resolving that Istio does is of like basically first class VIPs that either you create or it creates for internal traffic. So I do think it's worth maybe separating the idea that we're talking about a full DNS solution here, and we're talking about really how basically the behavior of host names introduced to the cluster that are like Istio specific, and the ones that end up outside the cluster, are usually resolved by those enterprise solutions. So Istio usually just passes those through, to be clear.
But the original use case was somebody overwrites google.com for everybody.
Right.
I think that was a
Google.com
helpful example.
right?
That was not
Right, but like we also have to realize like applications themselves can override googleapis.com. Right? Within a namespace, if I own the application, I can do that.
The issue is the blast radius, though, right? It's that somebody in some different, correct me if
Yes.
I'm wrong, but the original issue is that somebody in some different namespace can overwrite DNS for the entire cluster, the entire mesh.
Yes. Like that's clearly a big problem, right? Or at least, or you have to choose that you want that to be a problem or not, right? Which is the primary thing Kevin's proposal solves. But we're not trying to protect within a namespace somebody redefining google.com, because they can already do that for themselves.
How can they already do that in Ambient?
No, not in Ambient. In my application, right? I can have whatever code I want.
Oh, yeah,
That
sure.
means that, yeah, right. So like that, like DNS within an application boundary, which is what the namespace is not a security boundary around name resolution.
No, absolutely.
Shouldn't pretend.
In your application, you can also link a secure resolver that is doing DNS over HTTP, and then you are completely out of Istio DNS capture.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that's why I'm saying that we cannot rely on it.
No, like DNS is not a security boundary. No, nobody should think DNS is a security boundary. Right, that's what what zero trust is for. Right, DNS is a convenience, so people don't have to remember IP addresses.
You may remember that it's actually in Istio, it is a critical security element, because if resolution of my service dot is modified, then the entire security in Istio based on interception is compromised. So,
Istio does more than DNS does. I agree with that concept.
yes.
Istio makes sure that DNS agrees with identities, which is not anything that any enterprise DNS does.
So in practical terms, would it work? I mean, would you be able to achieve the same results without relying on DNS and with Kubernetes gateway semantics of, well-defined delegation and ownership of domain names instead of, any namespace being able to override any. I mean, do we need to support the feature? I mean, if the user already can in their etc host or whatever to change google.com, do we need to mess up with it in Istio?
Well, this is mostly to prevent foot guns, right?
Yeah, no, we want to prevent foot guns by not allowing client overrides, basically. I mean, it's basically each service entry stays within that namespace and nothing else. I mean, it's like HTTP route.
Right, but then we have other things that need names, right? So either you're resolving a namespace and then you're going to the global DNS, right, or the per cluster DNS, or you're going to something in between, like, or there's another layer in between those two things.
Or to the normal enterprise DNS split horizon, where you can have, google.com, but it's one per VPC basically.
Well,
So,
that's the same, like, that's almost the same as the global thing, right?
Yes, maybe, yeah.
Right. The problem we have is that has not yielded enough flexibility for people. Like the problem here, Kubernetes service is an insufficient API, right, for creating services that are consumed across namespace boundaries.
I looked into this recently. You can use cloud DNS or some enterprise DNS to pretty much, it's per VPC, so you can put private IPs and you don't interfere with the external one, and you can create multiple services with different names. And just like we did for version in Kubernetes Gateway instead of using destination rule. And that gives most of the flexibility that we need, meaning that you can create 20 different services with some naming convention, and then you can write backend ref and rules to distinguish them. It's not the same thing. You cannot override google.com, but you can create some names that you control that provide this kind of flexibility if you make some adjustments, basically. I mean, application may need to change what they resolved, or so it will not be google.com. If you want this kind of flexibility to have, I don't know.
I'm not quite sure what you're like. I get the idea, like some admin can go program some stuff in like a shared DNS.
Or a controller that allow user to program the DNS, but not override google.com, not have each namespace define its own google.com, but define some names that could be used instead of google.com to achieve the same result. So the question is, what is the use case? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to have google.com intercepted, or it's your own service that you are trying to intercept or to modify? I mean, service you own.
So I think the first thing is probably, like, I have some shared services, right, that are, let's say, on VMs that Kubernetes DNS is not aware of, that need to be made available, right, for discovery. Right, so I've got some stuff sitting on some VMs. I'm not trying to override google.com, right? And those things have a legacy name, right? So it's, mainframe.myorg.private. How do I get that into kubedns? And not just get it into kubedns, but actually get it into the service registry so I can see all the endpoints and do things that, even DNS SRV is insufficient for.
That's relatively easy. It's, if you use enterprise DNS, it's trivial. I mean, just
no, everybody keeps saying enterprise DNS like it's one thing with one interface. We all know that's not true, right? There are 17 of them with 17 different interfaces.
Yes, an external DNS is subtracting all of them and is programming, 25 or so. I mean, there is a huge list of DNS providers. So if you just install external DNS, we pretty much deal with pretty much all known DNS.
So you're saying we should have a requirement to have external DNS integration in the cluster?
Or, yes, that's an option.
And then we have to, right, the problem with that is that external DNS is only designed to learn about Kubernetes services.
Or a variation. I mean, use it as a library and program whatever. I mean,
Okay, right. So build a controller to synchronize this through the external DNS mechanism to push this upstream into some DNS.
For users who want to use enterprise DNS instead of core DNS. And for core DNS, there is an extension. I think we did a prototype early on where you modify core DNS to delegate to someone else. And then you can have Istio-D resolve the names that we need. So it's not important. I think there's several extensions for core DNS to do similar things.
Yeah, no, like okay, so we have the write a controller option, right? To program DNS, whether it's core DNS or enterprise DNS. So that's option something.
Yeah.
But we still have to do other things because we still have to handle VIPs, right?
Yeah, it can handle VIPs. It can do a lot of things with this solution. As long as you don't get into each namespace once we have a different view, I think we have plenty of options. If you get into the use cases for each namespace as a different view, then we have problem. It's more complicated.
Yes, that would be a big hurdle. So I guess the question, do people think we have a need for per namespace split horizon?
Not think strong evidence from customers that cannot live without it, because we all think we need everything, as you know, in Istio. But
Is John Howard here? He's the one who came up with that use case and said it was an important one. This is his comment.
He's on PTO.
Oh,
I mean, split horizon is the mechanism by which we are accomplishing effective multi-tenancy, right? So if we're not talking about split horizon, we're talking about continuing to break multi-tenancy such that other namespaces can impact my name resolution in surprising ways. Yes.
Well, Kubernetes itself doesn't have split horizon, Mitch.
yeah, and no DNS server. Nobody except Istio has split horizon at this granularity. There is a reason no other enterprise supports it, because nobody until us found a need for it. And DNS
I
has
guess
been
I'm not familiar with the ways to interact with kubedns that would hijack a name for clients and other namespaces, but that may just be my lack of familiarity with the problem.
Right. Kubernetes deals with this by namespacing all services into the namespace, right? So split horizon is meaningless, right? They force a naming scheme, right? Which is the other thing that Kevin had in his doc, right? So you can never have a name conflict.
Is that not that's why we require FQDNs for most operations Istio. But there is some form of, it sounds like there's some form of split horizon because when it comes to short names. Is that not a form of split horizon?
Well, that's not split horizon, right? Short name is client-side resolution, right? Like I take all the short name prefixes, I convert them into FQDNs, then I ask the DNS server.
Gotcha.
Split horizon is implemented in the DNS server.
in resolve.com search. But
Yeah, so that's just local search path.
if I can point out, we went exactly the same discussion in the gateway API when you had all these client overrides all over the place, and in the gateway it was decided, well, we agreed to first try to have the HTTP route delegation and not have the Istio flexibility. And so far, gateway users seem to be okay with this mechanism. And it's very important because DNS is critical. You can get ACME certificates. You can do all kind of stuff if you mess with DNS.
Yeah, no, like DNS, just it has consequences. Let's put it
Yes.
that way.
And many unexpected if you mess with it too much.
So, I guess one way to answer this question, right, is we can go and look at existing installs and see if they have the same FQDN defined twice in two different, defined in two different namespaces in the same cluster.
Yes, and
How often does that occur?
how often?
the answer.
Yes, that's correct answer.
If the answer is close to zero, We don't need split horizon. The problem there, right? And we have to put some API constraint in, right? Because the nature of the service entry API, which we're not able to get rid of, how do we prevent or report the fact that there's an error? Do we need to start updating status fields in service entry or something like that?
And maybe the bigger question is, what is the implication of having RBAC permission to create service entries that modify the DNS for others? Because that's really the fundamental problem, is how do you prove that you are authorized to modify google.com or myvm. Whatever.
Right.
There is no chain of custody here. So
right. I think the other problem is, there may be lots of how many service entries are in namespaces where the service entry name has nothing to do with the namespace name.
Exactly.
Right. So they're not qualified.
Yeah.
I suspect that's much more likely.
I think the thing that we're starting to circle around is, Louis, you mentioned that Kubernetes uses DNS a ton. I would challenge it a little bit in that DNS is very active within Kubernetes, but Kubernetes as an API doesn't really touch DNS at all. But there's, outside of everything that happens DNS-wise in Kubernetes is kubeDNS, CoreDNS, et cetera, running as a control loop, looking for new services and programming DNS accordingly, according to a spec, but not there's no real way to express resolution in Kubernetes from an API perspective, not to my knowledge.
I can have a service declared with a name, right? The name is namespaced, but I can say that it resolves to the endpoints resolved from a DNS call.
Yes, but so you can't take the API that Kevin proposing, right, and and tell CoreDNS to do that in Kubernetes, right?
Sorry, so I can't create a DNS name in Kubernetes that is not namespace scoped.
Yes, my point is, go ahead, sorry.
Right, that's the only protection Kubernetes has.
Right.
What happens after, or what those names are, right, or what's behind those names, there's no guarantee that the endpoints behind those names are also namespace scoped. There's no guarantee of that.
Correct. Right. What I'm saying is, I think my biggest concern with the proposal is the API. If we're going to get into setting up DNS resolution rules, then it feels like the best place to put that would be an API for DNS resolution rules. And Kubernetes does not have that, right? Kubernetes today, DNS is a series of controllers watching service and programming DNS entries according to a specification. There's no API for programming DNS entries, except to write services in such a way that conform to the spec. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I mean, what Istio did is not like Kubernetes. It's much more like Consul. The Consul is a DNS server. It did have an API to let you program arbitrary names with endpoints. Right? That was back in the day, right? Something that Istio needed to compete with to provide completeness, because not everything was running inside of Kubernetes. And not everything could have a Kubernetes name, right? If you were adopting Kubernetes, you weren't just adopting how you ran workloads, you were also adopting how you named services, right? It was just a big hammer. That was too restricting, right, to go into existing environments, right? So you had to be much more like a console, right, and allow people to allocate names and give them endpoints. That's what service entry is. It's a feature competitive with console.
Yes, and from what I'm understanding, reading through and hearing the API being proposed for configuring service entry, we're just basically telling Istio DNS across the cluster, and right now it's scoped to Ambient. So I want to be fair about that, but we're in Ambient, what we're telling the gtunnel DNS across the cluster, hey, use this resolution order to somewhat accomplish the equivalent. That's not quite split horizon, but it's just saying, hey, don't resolve if you're in these namespaces. Essentially, it's what I'm gathering. I don't know that mesh config. I don't know a set of options in mesh config is the right place for that. Like I feel like we're continuing to kind of move forward into the DNS world to, not at this point, it's not to compete, but it's to make the API consistent. But we stop short of a cohesive solution for DNS and Istio with the flexibility
so
that we want.
We provide a lightweight DNS overlay, right? It's designed to not stand alone. It's designed to sit in front of an existing DNS server, and it allows you to add names. That is the feature that we have provided.
Only if the DNS server doesn't enable signatures and the application verifies, which
Sure, right, but like
So-
we have some mechanisms to do that, but that is what we have done. Right, we have implemented a lightweight DNS server that fronts or proxies an enterprise DNS server or a Kubernetes one. That is what we have.
specifically,
We can choose to get rid of it, which means we should get rid of service entry, the API.
as a reminder, we implemented this specifically for the security issue that I mentioned. I mean, to intercept, services, Kubernetes services, to make sure that they cannot be hijacked. It was never meant for external names because external names don't rely on DNS security.
No. We implemented the DNS capture to ensure transport security custom. We implemented service entry to allow for name declarations because the Kubernetes one was too limiting. Those are two different things.
But the critical part for the DNS interception was the transport security because it was a security bug in Istio. I mean, the service entry.
Sure, but two different use cases. So
Yeah.
solving two different problems. Right?
Yeah.
They just happen to end up in the same machinery, but still two different use cases. Service entry, which is the thing Kevin's trying to deal with, is Kubernetes service wasn't flexible enough, and we didn't have, we aren't or weren't console or a standard writable DNS server that we can access. Now you proposed a solution to that, which is use external DNS to do it. But Kubernetes still doesn't have an API, right, to let you create and program a DNS server other than service, and it's very limited.
Kubernetes core.
We know it's
because Kubernetes does have, if you install the proper controller.
no, it has the mechanism. It has no API, Costa. What
Defines
API?
APIs. They have an API. I mean, DNS define. Well, it's a crappy API. It's not the best. It doesn't have security very well. But I think we don't. I'm not disagreeing with you that using Istio DNS interception is probably okay for many use cases. I'm not arguing with that. My concern is that the security delegation and posture and who's allowed to do that, and not allowing this kind of crazy any namespace can redefine any name, because the problem with DNS, I mean, Kubernetes DNS works because there is cluster local namespace and the order. But if you go to arbitrary namespace, there are very serious security implications if we allow, if we don't have a chain of custody or delegation. Meaning who's allowed to override Google.com. You need to have some RBAC and not allow arbitrary test namespace in a random tenant to take it over.
I think the proposal have that
Right,
RBAC tied to namespace.
Yes, I mean that's kind of what Kevin proposals does, right? We can implement it as like an admission controller instead. It's like who's allowed to create service entries, or basically who's allowed to write stuff into DNS logically or into the service registry. We already have that feature, or logically, right? We can go and tell people to use a standard admission controller.
Kevin, what does your proposal touch on virtual service and the sort of parallel problem that we have there with DNS resolution?
virtual service, the parallel problem I thought was with respect to export to. Virtual service, to my knowledge, doesn't hijack DNS like service entry hosts does. Maybe I'm not understanding what you're referring to.
I'm referring to a conversation 1 to 2 weeks ago in this meeting. We had talked about how this was solving problems in one spot, but not in the other. But perhaps I've lost a thread.
So I did briefly mention this here, but the context for that was what are we going to do with the export to field? And my favorite proposal, one we're talking about here, continues with the existing decision that export to is bogus, that we don't use it. It means nothing. So it means nothing in virtual service. It means nothing in service entry. Other solutions that don't meet as many of the design goals do bring back export to. So you could say, I think I called it solution 1, which was a slightly modified version of what happens today, where if we actually used default export service to, then it's not quite safe enough for multi-tenant, but at least the default isn't a foot gun, right? We could, for example, if we wanted default service export to work and virtual service to work, and we could set the default differently for ambient, then you could still hijack it maliciously, but you wouldn't do so by accident. You'd have to explicitly in your service entry update export to list the other namespaces or wildcard. I don't like that, and that was the context of the overlap.
Thank you.
Sanjeev?
Could we go back to the use case and maybe decide that the primary use case is not malicious hijacking of service entry resolution, but our intention to intentionally provide different tenants with different resolutions for the same FQDN. So if the primary problem being solved is malicious behavior, then it could be prevented by a admission webhook or something to just stop that config. But if we explicitly want to enable the fact that different tenants do want to be able to have different orders of DNS resolution, is that the issue here? Because if it is just preventing malicious behavior, then that's mostly a webhook. But if it is enabling certain multi-tenancy capability that we couldn't do otherwise, I mean, they can still do that, right? They can, as long as the exports are not handled incorrectly, they can still have their respective service entries be apparently conflicting in their own respective namespaces. So I guess what is going back is the primary use case preventing malicious behavior, or is it enabling something where different tenants can get some capability that they cannot get today? Because if it is just malicious behavior, then that can be stopped with admission controllers and things like that.
I'm not sure we can, because, well, first off, validating webhooks, at least with a lot of the environments that I've worked with, a lot of people, users of Istio, aren't allowed to use those in the first place, given providers of Kubernetes and the policies that they have for webhooks. Plus, the webhook could be down. But kind of even ignoring that objection, what we really need, I feel like, if we want export to, is we need RBAC on the export to field. Like, that's the field that gives me the most concern in the service entry API. And I just don't think there's a way in Kubernetes to add RBAC to one field in an API, which is why we're trying to move it elsewhere in this proposal.
But isn't that also, right, wouldn't that also be some sort of admission controller thing? Like, who are you allowed? If you own these namespaces, you shouldn't be able to modify the export behavior of other namespaces, right? I mean, I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact syntax here, but can that also not be handled by an admission controller? Like, malicious use of export to could be detected by an admission controller. Is that not possible? I'm done. Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud.
Right. So, I mean, I'll see if we can use admission control to protect what names are programmed by anybody in the cluster. Right. Export 2 was added to provide name resolution scoping for efficiency reasons. It's not a security thing, really, because it's written by the person who writes the resource. So whether they write export to all or none is kind of irrelevant from a security standpoint, right? If you wanted security, you'd have to have import from, right? Which the sidecar API did, but it was also overkill and nobody used it. And it was mostly, again, for config scoping reasons and efficiency, not for security. It did allow for split horizon, but that was probably a secondary concern to the config distribution problem. So I hope that gives you some clarity, Rajiv, on why. Like, so I don't think export 2 is that useful at all. I don't think it's a valuable feature anymore, especially not with ambient. Import, you could make an argument about it, but we don't have any of those efficiency problems anymore.
No, import is,
Right, so-
is the same. It's not RBAC. If you want security, use RBAC. There is no
Right.
play around it with security.
Right. So this is just the DNS problem, really. Right. Whether we want to have a split horizon or not.
So if you had import from, then that might have been cleaner, but you could, in theory, add admission controls on exports. If you have a multi-tenancy solution and tenant A owns namespaces ABC, then he can only export within ABC, not to some other tenant's namespaces. So I think the assumption on what is the kind of multi-tenancy model here, and whether that can be fit into an admission controller that uses export to and says, okay, you can't export into some other tenant's namespaces.
Right, but exporting into somebody else doesn't exist, right? Like the only theoretical security, right, is importing from or mutual agreement, right, where they both say, I export to you and you import from me. Then there's at least some form of known security contract. But export is just a way to say, I don't want this to be used by other people. Maybe there's some privileged information, but like DNS doesn't deal with any of that, right? Right. So on the one, like, are we making an argument saying, look, DNS is sufficient, right? And so how do we set up a world where whatever DNS is being used is sufficient, or we have a world where we like DNS is woefully insufficient and we need per namespace split horizon, right? Which is what import and export would provide for. Most of the arguments I've heard so far have been DNS is sufficient. We don't need per namespace split horizon. So all we need are controls to make sure that the right people are creating names in what is effectively a global-ish DNS world. Right, that's the fundamental question. Right? Do we want split horizon or not? Because they lead to two very different solutions. And then how do we upgrade users without breaking them?
The upgrade without breaking question is about current sidecar use cases and onboarding.
Right, we've already said we're not going to do import from the sidecar API is not used in ambient, right? So that's gone. The question is, look, service entry has been around for a while. People will update existing clusters within it. There will probably be cases where people have declared the same name twice. What happens? What should we do?
Gotcha.
And Kevin points to it, he talks about it in the doc. He says, look, we keep the existing behavior, right, which is just some form of precedence order to figure out which one of them wrote the right version of the resource. And then if anything beyond that is up to admission controls. Like, if you want more control over this, you have to write admission controllers.
Yeah, and again, going back to the early point, which is that if we want to provide this mechanism to have a preordained list prioritized list of namespaces and ordering of namespaces. That means we want to enable this behavior. We want multiple tenants to have conflicting service entries, and that's why we are going through the trouble of sort of allowing them a mechanism for defining an ordering of resolution. So the use case is not just preventing malicious behavior, or it's more that we see a common enough need for different tenants to have conflicting service entries.
And it's also a need to document how it works, actually. Like what Kevin has done here, you can express the existing resolution mechanism using the same syntax, right? And the order is dot, which means resolve in same namespace first, right? And then it's the next entry is star, which means resolve in any namespace. And that's the current behavior.
Then the question would be, what is that default to?
Yes, on upgrade versus install, if you can even tell the difference between those two things.
I mean, at the moment, we're not super concerned about upgrades. We don't see that there are a lot of users using Ambient today. It is a nice opportunity for this break. Eventually, we do want to support sidecar use cases onboarding Ambient, but that's pushed out until at least the spring. I guess it really doesn't matter how far it's pushed out. It's a problem we'll have to answer.
Right.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, like you can express the current behavior or something very close to it in Kevin's proposal. Is this just a documentation concern then, where we tell folks, listen, if you like the current behavior, if you're reliant on it, this is the setting that you should use?
I may have missed something, but I'm still not clear whether we have a consensus on whether the primary use case is preventing malicious behavior, or is the primary use case enabling conflicting entries because we think different tenants would actually want that. Which one is the primary use case? Is it preventing malicious behavior, or is it wanting to specifically enable multiple tenants to have apparently conflicting service entries?
Not breaking applications, I think these are critical that we cannot break. So if I have a namespace and it's working, another namespace should not be able to break me, whatever they do.
Right, so that's the malicious one.
Right. So you
Malicious, accidental, whatever. I mean, it's not necessary.
Yeah.
No. So what I was saying was, do we have consensus that is the primary use case here, preventing malicious behavior because of service entries getting hijacked unwittingly? Is that the primary use case, as opposed to explicitly wanting a behavior where different tenants can?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we want to prevent, like, it's probably not malicious. It's probably mostly accidental.
Right.
Right. We want clarity. And
because
we want
incompetence can be much worse than malice.
Yeah.
Right. So then,
so we want,
sorry, go ahead, please. Sorry to interrupt.
yes, we want a system that's resilient to accidental, right, interference.
So that, in my limited opinion, I think that reduces the need for adding new capability to essentially prevent misconfig. Because if we were enabling new config, which is new capability, which is desirable, that makes it more compelling to have a new feature, right? Because you're explicitly giving tenants the capability to have conflicting service entries. But if the primary use case is prevent malicious or unwittingly incorrect configuration, it seems to slightly reduce the priority of adding new capability to essentially reduce misconfiguration.
I'm not sure if that's an argument against implementing something or not, though, Sanjeev. You talked about priority, right? So, like, there's a research project to see how likely it is that there's this problem, which I don't know if we captured, Kevin, right? Which is like, how often do we see people colliding? If the probability looks high, or the consequences of colliding are large, then there's value in doing the work. Does that sound reasonable, Sanjeev?
Yes, I think that if we agree that the problem being solved is preventing malicious or unwittingly incorrect behavior, then it would be reasonable to have a perspective on how common this occurs in real life.
I mean, really what Kevin has done here is just codify into an API what is currently written in code, and not a user-facing API, an administrative API.
Yeah, but the solution is
debate.
Yeah, the solution is a perfectly valid solution if we decide that we want to solve this problem in this manner.
And then there's the separate philosophical question, right? So, like, viewing Kevin's solution as solving a narrow problem, which is like, what are we going to do with users and upgrades in the existing situation? Do we want to really have per namespace split horizon in the long run? And that's probably not just an us question, that's a Kubernetes question too.
Well, not only Kubernetes, because it mesh can be on VMs and everything. It's basically a IATF question or kind of a global question. Because it implies that all DNS will be handled by Istio. So Istio will take over.
Okay.
Wherever Istio.
Sure. Okay, then we are the deciders, and we're going to, like, we are the ones who say, like, secure and split horizon DNS is what you should do.
And all DNS belongs to us, and we are going to have secure DNS and all the other stuff that,
Sure.
DNS is doing, which we are not doing. We are doing, pretty poor job of DNS. We are not focused on DNS security in Istio.
We are focused on doing the bare minimum with DNS to enable the other things to work.
To enable some applications that are not very secure to work, because once you start using secure DNS of any kind, we are out of picture.
Isn't the following analogous problem also similar, right? I mean, two tenants could advertise the same URL for ingress. They could be running independent gateways, and they could both decide to be abc.com. And the second guy that comes along pushes into external DNS his gateway's IP, and he ends up clobbering the other tenants abc.com. So we do have other examples where two tenants can clobber each other in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots, right? Two different people trying to load their stuff into a gateway, claiming ownership of the same cert, right? Or trying to claim ownership of a route and an ingress to route traffic to my backend instead of yours.
Right, and so there hasn't typically been compelling solutions to prevent those cases. Not they saying that we shouldn't do it, but just as a data point, it hasn't been super critical, for better or worse, in the Kubernetes community to have solutions to prevent those kinds of clobbering. Both in the
we started to put a lot of work in the gateway API to try to prevent path clobbering, because it's a very easy attack vector on the ingress API.
Right,
That actually got some attention.
Yeah, like I said, two you have two tenants running independent gateways, they could end up advertising the same URL.
Sure, but then they're not sharing anything, right? Tendency is when they share something.
If I can, kind of put my opinion at least. I think per namespace DNS, it's something that requires a lot of thinking in terms of implication around how do we deal with secure DNS? I mean, DOC, DOT, all the others. And the question is if we can reliably even do this, because by definition, we cannot mess with DOC, DOT, and the others because they're secured. So maybe we can decouple it. I mean, maybe we can have a separate discussion about how we can properly implement split horizon and DNS, but still to unblock ambient and to have some minimal mechanism. We should start in P1 ambient with ability to have non-split horizon, basically one configuration for DNS, which works for both external and internal and DNS. And figure out what is the restriction. I mean, do we put an RBAC rule? Do we have only an istio system? Because that will be viable and will solve many of the use cases, not all of them, and give us more time to figure out if we can implement in any way an interception when the resolver is secured. Because that's really my concern. Once enterprise starts adopting the consumer, DNS resolving policies, which are based on secure protocols, there is no scenario where we can intercept and modify the DNS.
Yeah, the only thing we can do is write to the DNS.
Write to the proper DNS. So that's why external DNS is very important for Google or all the others. I think that's a reasonable argument, right? Which is like, look, at some point we won't be able to do DNS interception, or like relying on it is probably. Yeah, it's only a question when. I mean, we know that it took 2 years or so to get there in Chrome and browsers. But at this point, I don't think you can buy a phone that doesn't do secure DNS. So that's really the problem. We know that there is an expiration date of any solution that is relies on UDP DNS interception.
Right. So all we're saying is, in the interim, if the ultimate outcome is all we're doing is programming some other DNS, or we become the DNS, right? That's the other option.
We can't become the DNS. That's a problem. I mean, if the resolver in the pod has secure resolver.
No, like we're the DNS server address, whatever it is.
Yes. So they modify resolve.conf and explicitly set us as a DNS. Yes, that's kind of the same thing. I mean, it's still, there is a DNS server that is handling this, and I don't know if it's possible.
Okay, so we still have to make a decision for users being upgraded about what to allow to happen. We can keep the existing scheme, which allows for conflicts, right? We don't know if anybody's put admission control over the resources. We can't just stop supporting service entry API. We know we can't do that. We can, in the long run, say the way service entry API should work is there should be a controller that takes those things and programs them into a DNS server, and maybe there's another API that can be used for that down the road instead of service entry, right? If that be. But such an API does not exist right now. So that's basically status quo. Kevin's proposal is an improvement over status quo, and at least it documents explicitly in an API that we own what the hell that we do. Yes, it allows for some configuration of it, but for most people, they'll never change it. And we still adhere to the idea that at some point down the road, all we do is write a controller that uses service entry to program an external DNS, and we're not using interception.
Yeah, agreed. Kevin's proposal is an improvement over status quo. I guess maybe this, I might just go back yet one more time over this, which is mentioned earlier, which is that if we are setting up a feature where you can have a predetermined order of resolution of service entries, that means we actually want to support this capability. We want to support multiple tenants having conflicting service entries, which is why we are going out of our way to having a resolution mechanism to enable that.
Yeah, so there's a marginal difference between the two things, right? We could just leave it status quo and just leave the resolution ordering code, and wait for the controller thing to happen. I'm mostly not disagreeing. I see them as marginally different. That's all. It's not. I don't think it's making a big statement to users, because I don't think most users will ever touch it.
Yeah.
The only difference is that we want to support migrations, and so I wanted the default to be safer, right? If we leave it in code, then there's no way to configure it, and there's no way to migrate from classic to ambient. Because if we leave the old behavior, then we have the foot gun, which was the whole reason I wanted to do this in the first place. So we need some kind of toggle if we want to support like a nice migration path, as well as something that's safe for tenants. Hence the proposal.
Well, I think the option 0 is we leave the foot gun where it is. Right.
One other thing I'd like to point out is that the actual mechanism for setting that order seems like could cause friction between operational teams, right? I mean, let's say tenant 1 has set up a couple of service entries, and then tenant 2 comes along and it's fine. They're not conflicting. So far, so good. Tenant 3 comes along, and then some of these entries conflict with tenant 1, and some apparently conflict with tenant 2. Now the ops team needs to get together with tenants 1, 2, and 3 to figure out the right prioritization that will keep everybody happy, right? I mean, it feels like it will require a lot of back and forth between the tenants and the operations teams to come up. Who's to say that tenant 1 was right to begin with, right? I mean, just because it didn't have any conflict, that was not necessarily the enterprise approved or the right resolution. So tenant 3 might come along later and then cause a bunch of churn for all of it to be reconfigured. So I just feel like this, the operational procedure
that seems pretty unlikely, Renji. Like Sanjeev, like one, if they're all trying to declare the same name, right? There was already a conflict to begin with, because they all thought they owned a name. It wasn't tenancy, right? They were all trying to define something that was shared. That's an admin problem.
Yeah. So if you don't really want to, but at the end of the day, you'll have to come up with a resolution order, and that does involve interaction between the admin and one or more tenants. But if you simply want to block the fact that no two service entries should ever conflict, that does not require any operational interaction or friction between the operational teams. Just put in an admission controller saying two service entries shall never resolve the same URL to conflicting results.
You actually can't do that in an admission controller, Sanjeev. Admission controllers can only take the object you're creating as scope. They cannot compare to other objects, because then you get an ordered dependency in terms of which one will fail. It breaks the declarative API.
What about a controller that takes the export logic into account, which says if I have a service entry namespace A and has been exported to namespace B, and
But I think we're getting rid of export because it doesn't serve any function.
But yeah, I guess my point was that a solution that does not involve tenants having to have tickets going back and forth with the operations team might be smoother.
Yeah. So the other option, and Kevin kind of touches on it in the doc, is to say, look, there are namespaces that are allowed to declare arbitrary names, and there are namespaces that are only allowed to declare namespace scoped names. And all the tenants, right, are only allowed to declare namespace scope names, right? So they can never put something in the DNS that does not have their namespace in the name, right? So they can't write a service entry, right? So we could have that as an option. That would prevent footguns, right? Because you trust the admins, hopefully not to footgun themselves, or at least, like, you know, you have the admin of last resort problem. But that, right, is a relatively straightforward rule. Guarantees segmentation across tenants. They can never create google.com. Only the admin can do that. That is the other option. That one is safe because it's exactly what Kubernetes is doing.
Yeah.
It creates more tickets for the admins to approve, right? Because somebody needs to consume a service, it's shared. They have to go to the admin and say, hey, create this service for me. But that looks like the enterprise DNS flow, right? Because if you want something in enterprise DNS, you create a ticket. So we could do that. Right, so there's no split horizon. There's just segmented names. That, right, so we have the footgun version, which is what we have today, right? And we can leave it the way it is, or we can give you that option, right? And basically, it's just a list of admin namespaces that are allowed to declare arbitrary service entries and a flag. That is the other way to go about this. Not everybody will be able to do that, but
if they want to keep shooting the source in the food, they can use this plastic, you know, until they find a different solution. It's not like everyone must move to ambient immediately. There will be other blockers and other users. It's not. We need to have a secure and safe environment in ambient so we can turn it on by default and have a lot of adoption for ambient. But some users may have needs.
So that would give you that custom, right? Like, you can't create a service entry unless the name is namespaced.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Okay, so we think that's a viable option.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right, so there is that solves the tenancy problem, but not like some people will have to upgrade into footgun mode because they've done this, and we'll have to give them some recommendations, say how they get out of it. Kevin, what do you think about that? As because you kind of cover it in your doc, right? But I don't know if we.
Yeah, I that was really this sentiment here, and it agrees with what I was thinking.
Yes. So it's I wouldn't quite call it that in the talk, but kind of, right, is like indiscriminate service entry resolution true. Yes. So maybe Kevin, you and I could go spend a little time and maybe make that a little clearer as an option and say, like, this is how you choose between those two states, footgun or, you know, partitioned, namespaced, whatever we call it.
Yeah, we can discuss how we want to communicate to users. In the API, that was how I communicated it there, the for classic.
Yeah.
Migration.
Yeah. So I do suggest that people take a look at that, the implicit match naming export stuff, right? Because the thing in Kubernetes, right, all namespace names are exported, right? Everybody can see everything. And that would be safer.
And
all right, so
meanwhile, let's look a bit at the DNSSEC and the other specs that are related and figure out if there is a viable path or an option to intercept. I know for DOH and DOT it is probably possible to still intercept, but I'm not entirely sure about DNSSEC. Someone else should probably take a look.
Okay. But honestly, Custom, I want to stay away from being dependent on interception anyway, and like design the API to work either if we're able to intercept or if we have to have a controller that's up programming. And I think, yeah, I know we've spilled considerably over. But I do appreciate the time.
Yeah, thank you all. I appreciate the discussion. I know we're over. I think Yossi had another topic, but we're done.
Yeah, I think we have to be done. I've already missed one meeting. All right, thanks everyone.